In his Eitz Chaim Torah commentary, Rabbi Harold Kushner speculates that there are two types of holiness in life, two distinct ways of encountering the divine. There is natural holiness to be found in the miracles of pregnancy, birth, recovery from illness. To these, I might add the wonder of a sunset, or I remember 6 years ago, the utter stillness that I experienced when walking from the Colorado River up to the rim of the Grand Canyon. Kushner continues, there's also a stipulated holiness, the arbitrary designation of certain times, places, and activities as sacred. For example, Shabbat morning services, or the reading of the Megillah tonight and tomorrow on Purim. Our friend Ellen Davis shared a phrase this week that helps us understand how those rituals function. They are orientations for disorientation. Before we pray, we orient ourselves to the east, but not only to find Jerusalem, but to remind us that wherever we are not home. We are disoriented. We have not been in God's presence, and ritual prayer can correct that and bring us into God's presence. Kushner explains that one meets God in the experiences of birth and death and sickness and health, but they are not everyday occurrences. They happen sometimes, but the person who yearns for contact with God on a regular basis must rely on sanctuaries, on worship services, on prescribed rituals, all of which are holy only because we have chosen to designate them as holy. And as we will read about for the next many, many weeks in the book of Leviticus, certainly the priestly writers, the Israelite society, saw these two types of holiness as being mutually exclusive. We begin the book of Leviticus, in which we will encounter the terms tameh and tahor and tameh. Often these are badly translated as clean and unclean, or pure and impure. But according to Kushner's understanding, someone who is tahor, pure, is somebody who has gone through a process of transition, a purification, if you like, and that person is now able and prepared to experience ritualized or stipulated holiness in the temple or tabernacle. Tameh, which is most of us most of the time, is someone who has had an encounter with everyday holiness, a moment in which we have been reminded of the awesome fragility of life. And because we cannot approach the temple either because we don't need to, or if we want to, we have to wait. And we have to let that experience fade and immerse ourselves in a mikvah. But Jewish tradition stipulates that there must be a transition. There has to be a break between what's going on in everyday holiness and when we come to ritualized holiness. Jewish holidays, as I mentioned before, are stipulated or ritualized holiness. Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. For 25 hours, we experience a world of holiness in which no one works for anyone else. A day in which all people are free. A day of quiet and study and prayer, when our job is not to take, but it is to receive, not to do, but to be. And Purim tonight is another very strange ritualized holiness. It is even frightening. It is a day on which we don't just read, but we actually inhabit the world of the book of Esther. And it's not a beautiful world. It is a day on which we imagine that a genocidal decree hangs like a sword over the Jewish people. A world where God is absent. A world where the Jewish people are in exile. And where we must navigate politics and palace intrigue in order to save ourselves. And terribly at the end of the story, because according to the bizarre rules of Esther's world, the king's decree against us cannot be turned away. Jews must slaughter tens of thousands of our enemies. And we, as listeners to the story, must listen to that slaughter described. And as I think about listening to the Megillah tonight, the question that I'm feeling is what happens if we don't need or don't want the ritualized holiness of Purim this year, because so many of these things are all too present in our world at this moment. 5.5 months ago, we danced with the Torah while Hamas terrorists were still burning Jews alive in their homes, attempting a genocide to kill and rape and torture as many Jews as they could. It is something they've said they will continue to do again and again. And as we stand here today, the IDF has killed more than 30,000 people in Gaza. A number that includes many Hamas terrorists, and that also includes thousands of women and children. This year, I feel the need for a separation between everyday life and Purim because they feel too close to each other. I don't feel like I need a ritual to inhabit a world where genocide threatens us or where Jews might use power to kill our enemies. It all feels very real already. Traditionally, one might go to mikvah in order to create that separation between tameh and tahor, between ordinary and ritualized holiness, but assuming all of us, myself included, are not going to get to a mikvah between now and tonight, what I suggest is that as we celebrate Purim this year, we do so with an awareness of the holiday's dangers. Not only of getting drunk and making bad decisions, but with an awareness of how the book was written for a time and a place when Jews were in exile, for a time and a place when Jews were powerless, and how the existence of the state of Israel, a miracle for which I am ever grateful, but it has to change the way in which we relate to Purim. Zionist thought never limited itself merely to physically bringing Jews together in the land of Israel. It sought to challenge Jews with the responsibility of sovereignty. And in doing so, to return Jews to being active rather than only passive actors in history. And so a Zionist stance towards Purim must recognize how Judaism and Jewish identity is changed when Jews have an army and exercise state power. We dare not relate to Purim and the Esther story the same way we did when we were in exile and without power. We have to recognize that while we did experience an act of genocide on October 7th, we don't live in Ahasuerus's kingdom. We can protect ourselves, not just by winning the sympathies of a foolish and feckless king, We have to recognize we have an army and there are horror and consequences of killing tens of thousands of people. This is not a fable. It is not a violent fantasy. Even in fighting an enemy that uses civilians as human shields, those deaths will have repercussions for generations to come. Just as the Bible requires a transition between Tameh and Tahor, our entry into inhabiting the texts and mitzvot of Purim require us to acknowledge that this book is not history, that its examples are not ones that we should simply follow, that lessons that we do learn from it must be filtered through a lens of what is moral, that we must bear in mind always the ways in which our world is not only similar, but also different from that of the Megillah. I want to finish with the words of a friend and colleague, Rabbi Chai Levy, who is the rabbi of Nitivot Shalom. She spoke eloquently a few weeks ago at the blessing of Adar Bet about the challenges of observing Purim this year. She said, scholars understand this story as satire, comedy, and this story is dangerous if taken seriously. Just recall Baruch Goldstein, may his memory be erased, the Jewish settler who 30 years ago on Purim murdered 29 Palestinian Muslims in Hebron using the commandment to wipe out Amalek as his twisted justification. Some Israeli leaders have invoked Amalek after October 7th. How do we celebrate Purim this year? I'm going to be struggling with this over the next 2 weeks, she said, as I'm sure we all will, just as we struggled to figure out how to celebrate Simchat Torah on October 7th. These are questions we haven't had to answer before, as our generation is experiencing like we never have before, both Jewish vulnerability and Jewish power. Ultimately, Purim is about creating the antidote to cruelty, fear, and violence through the mitzvot of Purim that are about generosity, joy, and connection. We read the Megillah to learn how to listen. We have a Sudah with others and send Mishloach Manot to build community. And we give gifts to the poor through Matanot Le'evyonim. And in that way, the words of the Megillah can be fulfilled. Lahudim Haita Ora V'Simcha. We will make light and joy and gladness, even as we wrestle with a story that feels a bit too real this year. Shabbat Shalom. Please rise, the Chatzi Kaddish before Musaf on page 184.